All right, today we're going to dive into what's happening in Cuba right now, a really serious crisis. And we'll be looking at an analysis that says you can't understand today's struggles without looking back at over 60 years of U.S. policy. So let's get right into it.
The article we're looking at kicks things off with this really powerful phrase, Cuban sorrow. And I think that's important because right away it puts the focus where it should be, on the real people and the human side of this crisis.
So what does this crisis actually feel like for the people living there? Well, it all starts with a massive fuel shortage, and the effects are just devastating. The source talks about 3 huge power grid collapses in a single month. Just think about that. No electricity means food is rotting, businesses have to close, even government offices have shut down. I mean, daily life has been completely turned upside down.
And if you're wondering why a fuel shortage hits Cuba so hard, this number right here explains a lot. 83%. That's a huge number. It's the percentage of Cuba's electricity that comes from oil. So when you're that dependent and that supply gets cut, well, pretty much everything just grinds to a halt.
Okay, so that brings us to the big question, right? How did it get to this point? The article we're looking at makes a strong case that you really can't understand what's happening today without going back in time, way back actually. We're talking about 60 years of history. It's a long and pretty complicated story.
Let's walk through some of the key moments on this timeline. It all really starts back in the early 1960s, right after the Cuban Revolution. By 1962, the U.S. makes its trade embargo official. Then, fast forward a few decades to 1996, and you get the Helms-Burton Act, which really took the embargo to a global level. And then, much more recently, Cuba was put back on the state sponsor of terrorism list, which, as we'll see, had huge financial consequences.
This is really interesting. It's about how 2 different words can describe the same policy, but give you a completely different feeling about it. So the U.S. government officially calls its policy an embargo. That sounds like a simple ban on trade with one country. But the source points out that people in Cuba call it a blockade. And a blockade, well, that's a much stronger word. It suggests an attempt to totally isolate a country from all trade, from the rest of the world.
So let's zoom in on that law from 1996, the Helms-Burton Act. This was a real game changer. Basically, it's a U.S. law that says if any foreign company anywhere in the world does business with Cuba, they can be penalized by the United States. The source uses some pretty powerful language to describe this. It says the U.S. basically conscripted, or you could say drafted, the global business world into helping enforce its embargo. And it's not just about trading goods. It's also about money and banking. The article highlights that when the U.S. put Cuba back on that state sponsor of terrorism list, the impact was huge. Why? Because it essentially locked Cuba out of the global banking system. Imagine trying to run a country when making even basic international transactions becomes almost impossible.
Okay, so we've seen the history and we've seen the impact on the ground. But that leaves a big question. The Cold War has been over for decades, so why is this policy still in place? Well, the article we're exploring has a pretty direct answer for that. It gets into the politics that it claims are really driving this.
To build its case, the article points to things like this quote, which it attributes to former President Donald Trump. And the argument here is that this type of statement isn't just talk, it actually reveals a lot about the mindset and the framing behind the U.S. policy towards Cuba. And all of this brings us to what is really the central argument of the source material. It claims that this decades-long policy isn't actually about protecting U.S. national security. Instead, the article argues that the main goal is political, specifically that it's about appealing to the powerful right-wing Cuban-American community in Florida, which is a really important state in U.S. elections. Then, the analysis takes a step back. It argues that what's happening with Cuba isn't just about Cuba. It suggests we should see it as just one part of a much bigger picture, a wider geopolitical strategy. So how does it all connect? Well, take Venezuela. The article claims that when the U.S. took action against Venezuela, one of the goals was to indirectly hurt Cuba. How? By cutting off Cuba's #1 source of fuel, which for years had been coming from, you guessed it, Venezuela. This leads to an idea the source calls the chain of impunity. It's presented as a kind of 3-step pattern. Step 1, intervene in Venezuela. Step 2, use that situation to squeeze Cuba. And step 3, according to the article, is that these actions then make it easier to pursue similar policies against other countries, like Iran. The whole idea is that when one action isn't challenged, it sort of paves the way for the next one.
All right, so we've gone through the crisis itself, the long history, and the political arguments that the source presents. But the article doesn't just leave it there. It actually ends with a really strong call to action, aimed at the rest of the world.
So what does it want the world to do? Well, it's pretty clear. First, it calls for other countries to condemn these policies publicly. Don't stay silent. Second, it says the world needs to provide humanitarian assistance directly to the people of Cuba. And finally, it argues that all of this should be done together through the United Nations.
And that really brings us to the final thought here, a big question that this whole situation raises. It goes way beyond just Cuba or the United States. The question is this: when the policies of one country create a crisis in another country, what is the role, what is the responsibility of the global community? It's something really important to think about in the world we live in today.